We're really lucky that we've received a couple of fairly substantial grants from Coeliac UK, joint with Innovate UK, very recently. And I'll tell you a bit about each of them. But maybe the most important thing is to explain the problem that we're trying to solve. So this will be really familiar to many, many people who listen to this. When you think you might have celiac disease, or when your doctor thinks you might have celiac disease, you might first of all have a blood test, which might indicate you've possibly got it. But very many people will go on and have a biopsy. And of course, you need to have an endoscopy in order to have that biopsy. And for many people, worse than that, you need to eat gluten for a considerable period of time and quite large amounts in order to make sure that the biopsy does actually show the features of celiac disease if you've got it, because you don't want to have a false negative from not eating enough gluten. And for many people, that makes them fairly unwell, and it's not a nice process. So when a biopsy is given to a pathologist, actually, it's not straightforward. It's easy to say, gosh, the pathologist should get it right. But actually, you're looking at a very complex piece of tissue. And I might give you the example that, let's say you took a whole load of oak trees, and let's say that each biopsy of the small intestine is like an oak tree. And what you're asking people to do is to separate the oak trees into two groups, of one group that looks a bit like each other and a separate group that looks a bit different from the first group. And it's not an easy thing, and there are often not clear cut-offs. So to solve the problem of there being some level of uncertainty about the diagnosis, also to try and solve the fact that people on a gluten-free diet may have a completely normal-looking biopsy, and perhaps to try and prevent you having an endoscopy altogether and provide an additional type of blood test that we can add to the current blood test to make diagnosis easier. We've come up with a system where we look at the cells of the immune system at their genetic level, and we look for a specific signature, if you like, of those cells that says you might have celiac disease. I'm someone who's lived and breathed the immune system since I was a student. It's something I'm very enthusiastic about, so please excuse that. But actually, I think lymphocytes, which are the white cells that make up much of the immune system, are really clever cells. And the reason they're clever is that when they develop, they each change their genetic code very slightly. And they just change the bit that codes for what they can recognize and respond to and attack. And everybody will make some lymphocytes that might recognize gluten, might recognize bits of their small bowel. But in many people, those cells will be got rid of or won't be allowed to do anything. But in people with celiac disease, those cells will be allowed to make copies of themselves, and so there are more of them. And so we've got a way now of looking at that genetic code in the lymphocytes, in the white blood cells, to say, have we got a genetic signature in those white blood cells that indicates you might have celiac disease? And we've done that by taking samples from people we know have celiac disease, we're really, really sure about, and samples from people who we're really sure don't have it, and comparing them for this genetic code. And that way, we have found a way of telling those two groups apart, which means that then when we take a sample we're not sure about, we can say, which of those two groups is that sample more like? So this has involved two things. It's involved us making a new way of analysing the DNA in those lymphocytes. And we've been doing that with a lovely company in Birmingham called Nonicus, really super team. And we've really enjoyed working with them. And we've now made a new way of analysing those lymphocytes that works really well. We've also had to make a way of analysing the enormous amount of data that we generate when we do that. And we've been very lucky. I've worked with a collaborator in Liverpool who's absolutely super, and we've actually patented, or at least filed an application to patent that new approach. And I have to say, if we manage to go forward with this, Coeliac UK will benefit from some of the revenue that comes from that, which will be great. And so we've got these two things. We've got the way of assessing the DNA in the lab, and then the computer-based way of assessing those results to make a way of separating biopsies by whether or not they show features of celiac disease, which potentially could be a new way of giving a more robust analysis of biopsies. Is this celiac disease or not? So it will hopefully remove the uncertainty. The other thing it will hopefully do is allow us to test people on a gluten-free diet without them having to eat gluten, because we've shown that even if you're on a gluten-free diet, your biopsy still carries that signature that says you've got celiac disease, which is incredibly helpful, and no other test can pick that up. What we're really hoping, though, is that we can look for those white blood cells in the blood. And what we'd like to be able to say is actually we don't need to do an endoscopy at all, but we can take a blood test alongside the current screening blood test for celiac disease, and we can determine whether or not you've got celiac disease just from that. And so we've been collecting blood samples for nearly 2 years now. They're all surplus to diagnostic requirements, so they would otherwise have gone in the bin. And we are using those samples to develop the test on. So that's the first project, and we really, really hope that we might develop a test that looks at white blood cells to diagnose celiac disease better. Now, we can't prove that's going to work, but we're very hopeful. But in case it doesn't, we have another testing strategy that we're working on, which is looking at the biopsies themselves. So people like myself look down the microscope at biopsies, and we make a decision about whether we think it's celiac disease or not. And that goes back to the visual similarity to oak trees that I've given you. We're trying to look at all these oak trees down the microscope with all their different shaped branches and leaves in different places. And we're trying to say which ones are more like each other, which ones are a group of celiac oak trees, if you like, and which are a group of non-celiac oak trees. And it's actually really difficult. So what we've decided to do is to scan a large number of these biopsies under the microscope. So we take a picture of them essentially on very high magnification. And we are then working with some super mathematicians here in Cambridge who are looking at ways that we can measure aspects of the biopsy to try and make an automatic way of deciding which biopsies have celiac disease and which don't. And again, we've started off looking at ones that obviously have celiac disease and ones that clearly don't. And then we've got some in that grey zone in the middle where we do know what the eventual answer was, but we're going to see how our system does once we've finished making it. Probably we're going to make something called a neural network that does this, and that's actually like making a human brain within a computer. So we're sort of going to reconstruct a pathologist's brain somewhere in a computer, which is rather fun. Maybe it'll put me out of a job, maybe it won't. But this, if it doesn't work as a standalone diagnosis, it may be that these two approaches, looking at the biopsy and also looking at the DNA from the white blood cells in it, together can give us a really accurate way of diagnosing celiac disease. So we are incredibly grateful to both Coeliac UK and Innovate UK for giving us this funding. And we really do hope that at the end of it, we will have something we can go forward and test in some bigger studies as a new diagnostic for celiac disease.